The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that happens when something is so wrong that no one knows how to respond. A 13-year-old boy stood as the verdict was read, guilty. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The judge sat with an expression of controlled authority. The jury members looked away. The victim's family gripped each other's hands so hard their knuckles turned white. And then something happened that no one in that room expected. The boy turned toward the gallery where cameras were positioned. He looked directly at the lens, and he waved. Not a small wave, not a nervous gesture, a clear, confident wave, as though he was acknowledging an audience, as though he was thanking people for watching, as though being found guilty of murder was somehow something to celebrate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's expression changed from controlled to something else entirely. In that single moment, everything shifted. In that single wave, a 13-year-old boy revealed something about himself that would seal his fate. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't reward arrogance, it documents it. If you believe that accountability matters, no matter how young someone is, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. Let's look at how a moment of disrespect became the most damning piece of evidence in a case about childhood and consequence. Before the wave, there was a neighborhood, a quiet street where families kept their lawns trimmed and their doors locked and their routines predictable. The victim was someone these families knew, not a close friend, not a dramatic presence. A person who existed in the background of their daily lives, a person who worked hard, a person who kept to himself, a person who had done nothing to deserve what happened. The boy who would be accused of killing him lived just 3 houses away. They had never had a conflict. There was no known animosity between them. The boy was 13 years old. He was small for his age. He was the kind of kid that you wouldn't look twice at if you passed him on the street. He lived with his mother and stepfather. He went to school. He did his homework. He seemed normal in every way. But somewhere beneath the ordinary surface, something darker was developing. Resentment, anger, a sense that he was different, that he was special, that normal rules didn't apply to him. And one night, those feelings would transform into action. Courtroom was absolutely still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from respect or reverence, but the kind that comes from shock. The jury foreperson had just finished reading the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words had hung in the air for a moment before the reality of them began to settle over the room like fog. The judge had listened without changing expression. The prosecutor had allowed himself a small nod. The victim's family had begun to cry. And then the boy had turned. He was 13 years old, small enough that he had needed a cushion on his chair to see properly over the defense table during the trial. He was not tall enough to look directly into a camera without tipping his chin upward, but he had tipped his chin upward, and he had looked directly at the news camera positioned in the back of the courtroom. And he had waved, not a tentative wave, not a wave that suggested uncertainty or fear. A wave that was confident and clear and casual, the kind of wave you give to friends in the hallway at school, the kind of wave that suggests you are acknowledging people who care about you, who are supporting you, who are on your side. The gasps started almost immediately. They came from different parts of the courtroom simultaneously, from people who couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. A woman in the gallery put her hand over her mouth. A man stood up involuntarily, then sat back down. The victim's mother made a sound that was something between a sob and a shout of protest. The judge's eyes narrowed. The judge's expression, which had been controlled and professional, shifted to something that suggested anger. The judge was a woman named Patricia Hernandez. She had presided over hundreds of cases. She had maintained composure in situations that would have unraveled most people. She had seen defendants cry. She had seen defendants act out. She had seen defendants show remorse or defiance or confusion. But she had rarely seen a defendant show what this boy had just shown, a complete lack of understanding of the gravity of his situation, a complete inability to recognize that what he had done was wrong, A wave at a moment when any normal human being would be experiencing something other than the kind of casual confidence that comes from waving at an audience. The defense attorney had put his head in his hands. The prosecutor had leaned back in his chair with an expression of disbelief. The bailiff had moved slightly, as though preparing for something, though he wasn't quite sure what. The boy's mother, who was in the gallery, had looked away. She couldn't bear to watch what her son was doing. She couldn't bear to see the moment when his true nature was revealed to everyone in that room. The boy's stepfather simply stared at him. There was something in the stepfather's expression that suggested that in that single moment he had given up. He had given up trying to understand his stepson. He had given up trying to believe that there was something good in him, something salvageable, something worth saving. The wave had done that. One simple gesture had changed the way people perceived him. Judge Hernandez waited for the commotion in the courtroom to die down. She waited for the gasps to fade. She waited for people to remember where they were and remember that they were in a court of law where decorum was expected. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet but carried through the courtroom with the kind of authority that comes from years of demanding respect. She said that she was going to suspend the sentencing hearing. She said that she needed time to consider how to proceed. She said that the defendant's behavior during the reading of the verdict had shown her something important about his character, about his understanding of what he had done, about his capacity for remorse. She said that this behavior would be taken into account when she delivered her sentence. She said that the defendant was to be remanded to custody and was not to have any contact with the gallery or the media. And then she looked directly at the boy, and she said one thing that seemed to burn into everyone's consciousness. She said, "That wave told me everything I need to know about you." The boy's expression finally changed. The confidence that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial began to crack. For a moment, he seemed to understand that he had made a mistake. For a moment, he seemed to grasp that the wave, which he had apparently thought would be received as clever or charming or memorable, had actually been received as something that revealed his fundamental disconnection from reality. The bailiff approached him. The boy stood. He was led away from the courtroom. As he passed the victim's family, he did not look at them. As he passed the gallery where his mother sat, he did not look at her. He looked forward. The confidence was gone. But it was replaced not by remorse, but by something else. A kind of empty confusion, as though he still didn't fully understand why people had reacted the way they did. The courtroom slowly emptied. The victim's family was approached by supporters and relatives who wanted to express sympathy and solidarity. The media rushed out to begin covering the story. The headline would focus on the wave. The image of the 13-year-old boy waving after being found guilty of murder would be played and replayed across news outlets. The gesture would become the defining moment of the trial, not the evidence, not the testimony, not the verdict itself. But that single moment when the boy had revealed, in a gesture that was intended to be innocent or clever. Something about his personality that suggested he was incapable of understanding the seriousness of what he had done, the severity of his actions, or the impact of his crime on the people around him. The wave, intended as a gesture of acknowledgement or celebration, had become a moment of revelation. It had become the moment when a 13-year-old boy had inadvertently shown the court who he really was. Before the wave, there was a man. His name was Robert Crawford. He was 53 years old. He had lived in the same neighborhood for 27 years. He had bought his house when he was younger, when property values in the area were lower, when he believed he was settling in a place where he would build a life, raise a family, grow old. The marriage that had been supposed to last forever had ended in divorce 15 years earlier. The children that had been supposed to fill the house had grown up and moved away. But Robert had stayed. He had stayed in the house. He had stayed in the neighborhood. He had stayed in the routines that had structured his life for nearly 3 decades. His routine was predictable and unremarkable. He went to work at a logistics company where he had been employed for 22 years. He was a manager. He was respected by his colleagues. He was the kind of person who showed up on time, who did his job well, who didn't create drama or complications. He came home in the evening. He would sometimes have dinner with neighbors. He would sometimes sit on his porch and watch the neighborhood go by. He was the kind of person who existed in the background of other people's lives. He was not someone who demanded attention. He was not someone who sought the spotlight. He was simply a man who had built a quiet life and was content with it. The neighborhood where Robert lived was typical of suburban communities across the country. The houses were built in the 1990s, when construction standards emphasized affordability over uniqueness. The houses were similar to each other. They had similar layouts. They had similar yards. The people who lived in the neighborhood were also similar in many ways. They were working people. They were people who had jobs that required them to be somewhere at a specific time. They were people who valued safety and predictability, and the kind of order that comes from structure and routine. The neighborhood was the kind of place where you could walk down the street at night and feel safe. It was the kind of place where children played outside. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other and asked about each other's families. Robert was woven into the fabric of this neighborhood in a way that was quiet but significant. He was the man who would help his neighbors with projects around their homes. He was the man who would watch packages when neighbors were away. He was the man who would remember to ask about someone's sick parent or child. He was not a close friend to anyone in particular, but he was a person that everyone knew, that everyone respected, that everyone felt safe around. He was the kind of neighbor that people often don't fully appreciate until they are gone. He was the kind of person whose presence made a community feel stable and secure. The boy who lived 3 houses away knew Robert, but not in any meaningful sense. They had exchanged waves on the street. They had seen each other at neighborhood gatherings. There was no conflict between them. There was no known tension or animosity. Robert had no reason to fear this boy. The boy had no reason to harbor resentment toward Robert. They existed in the same neighborhood, but their lives did not intersect in any significant way. Or at least, that was what everyone believed before that night. That was what everyone believed before the boy made a choice that would destroy Robert's life and damage the neighborhood forever. That was what everyone believed before the routine of daily life in this quiet suburban community was interrupted by an act of violence that no one had seen coming. The evening before his death, Robert had called his ex-wife. They maintained a cordial relationship. They spoke occasionally to check in, to share updates about their adult children, to maintain some connection to the life they had once shared. In that phone call, Robert had mentioned that he was planning to have dinner with some neighbors the following weekend. He had mentioned that work had been good, that a project he had been managing was coming together nicely. He had sounded content. He had sounded like a man who was satisfied with his life, who had made peace with the choices he had made, who had found a way to be happy even though things hadn't worked out the way he had planned. That phone call would be the last conversation his ex-wife would have with him. That phone call would be the last time she would hear his voice. The last time she would have the opportunity to express how much he had mattered to her. The last time she would be able to tell him that she cared about him, even though their marriage had ended. The evening was cool and clear. The sun had set about an hour earlier. Streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting pools of light on the sidewalks and driveways. It was the kind of evening where people could still see their way safely, where there was enough light to navigate, but where darkness was beginning to claim the spaces between the lights. A 13-year-old boy left his house at 7:45 in the evening. He was wearing dark clothes. He was not carrying anything notable. He was walking with purpose. A neighbor happened to be putting out trash cans and noticed the boy walking down the street, but thought nothing of it. Children walked around the neighborhood frequently. It was a safe place. There was no reason to think twice about seeing a young person walking. The boy walked 3 houses down the block to Robert Crawford's home. The house was familiar to him. He had passed it hundreds of times. He knew the layout of the property because he had walked past it for years. He knew which windows had light, which doors were typically locked, which parts of the property were visible from the street, and which parts were more private. As he approached the house, Robert was inside. Robert had eaten dinner. Robert was in the process of settling down for the evening. He was not expecting anyone. He was not prepared for what was about to happen. The boy approached the front door and knocked. Robert answered. They did not know each other well. But Robert was a polite man. He did not refuse to open the door to a young person from the neighborhood. The boy was 13. The boy looked younger than his age. The boy did not appear to be a threat. Robert did not perceive any danger. They spoke briefly. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, and then something changed. The boy's demeanor shifted. The boy's intention became clear, and an act of violence began. The details of the violence itself are not necessary to understand the case. What is necessary to understand is that the act was sudden and brutal, and that it resulted in Robert's death. What is necessary to understand is that a man who had lived peacefully in his home for 27 years was killed in his home by a boy from the neighborhood who he did not have any conflict with. What is necessary to understand is that this act of violence was not committed in a moment of passion or in response to a direct threat. It was committed deliberately and with intent. The body was discovered approximately 40 minutes later. A neighbor had noticed lights on in Robert's house that seemed unusual. The neighbor had become concerned and approached to check on him. The neighbor found Robert on the floor. The neighbor immediately called emergency services. Police arrived within minutes. The house became a crime scene. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. The body was removed. The space where Robert had lived his quiet life was transformed into a place of investigation and police activity. A street camera several houses down the block had captured footage of the boy arriving at Robert's house and leaving Robert's house. The timestamps were clear. The clothing matched descriptions that would later be obtained. The camera had recorded the entire sequence of events. The camera had captured the walk to the house, the arrival, the approximate time of the violent act based on the time between arrival and departure and the departure from the house. The camera had captured it all. The evidence was clear. The path of the investigation was straightforward. The person responsible had documented his own crime through his presence on the camera. The boy was brought in for questioning approximately 3 hours after Robert's body was discovered. He was 13 years old. He was accompanied by his mother and a lawyer that she had immediately contacted. The boy was placed in an interrogation room with 2 detectives. One detective was a man named James Mitchell, who had been investigating crimes in this district for 18 years. The other was a woman named Sarah Chen, who had been investigating juvenile cases for 12 years. They were experienced at interviewing young people. They understood that the way children responded to questioning was often different from the way adults responded. They understood that children sometimes had difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and reality, between what they had imagined and what they had actually done. The boy was asked where he had been in the evening. He said he had been at home. He said he had spent the evening in his room. He said he had not left the house. The detectives noted that this statement contradicted the information they already had. They did not immediately confront him with the contradiction. Instead, they asked additional questions designed to establish a timeline. The boy provided details about what he had watched on television. He provided details about what he had eaten. He provided details that were designed to establish his presence at home during the time of the crime. But his responses had a quality to them that suggested rehearsal. His responses sounded like they had been prepared. His responses sounded like he had practiced them. The detectives asked about his relationship with Robert Crawford. The boy said that he didn't really know Robert. The boy said that they had waved at each other occasionally, but had never had a real conversation. The boy said that he had no reason to have any conflict with Robert. The boy said that he had nothing to do with what happened to Robert. As he was saying all of this, the boy's demeanor suggested a kind of calm confidence. He did not appear nervous. He did not appear frightened. He did not appear to be experiencing the kind of anxiety that would be typical of a 13-year-old who was being questioned by detectives about a murder. Instead, he appeared almost bored. The detectives showed him the street camera footage. They asked him to look at the images of a young person wearing clothes similar to what he was wearing, walking down the street toward Robert's house at the time of the murder. The boy looked at the footage and said that it wasn't him. He said that it must be another kid from the neighborhood. He said that the footage was unclear and could be anyone. The detectives asked him if he would be willing to provide his clothing from the evening so that they could compare it to what was shown in the video. The boy's mother conferred with the lawyer. The lawyer advised his client not to cooperate with the request. The interrogation continued for another hour, but no additional information was obtained. When the interrogation concluded, the detectives had one clear understanding. The boy was lying. His statements did not match the video evidence. His timeline did not align with the information they had obtained from neighbors. His appearance did not match his claims about what he had been doing. But the detectives also understood that lying during an interrogation is not the same as being guilty of a crime. They had to build a case based on evidence. They had to prove their suspicion through forensic investigation and testimony and the accumulation of facts that would be difficult to dispute. The interrogation was over, but the investigation was just beginning. The boy was released to his mother's custody, but he was told not to leave the jurisdiction. He was told that further questioning would be necessary. He was told that the investigation was continuing, and as he left the police station with his mother, he showed no sign of concern or fear or worry about what was going to happen next. The digital forensics team began their work immediately. They collected footage from every street camera, every doorbell camera, every home security system in the neighborhood. They created a timeline. They mapped the boy's movements from his house to Robert's house to the point where he had left the neighborhood. The timestamp data was precise. The camera angles were clear. The evidence was undeniable. The boy had left his house at 7:45. He had walked directly to Robert's house. He had arrived at 7:52. He had left at 8:23. He had returned to his house at 8:31. The timeline matched the estimates of when the crime had occurred based on the body's condition. The clothing that the boy had been wearing when he left his house matched the clothing shown in the street camera footage. The shoe prints that investigators had photographed at the crime scene matched the shoes that the boy had been wearing. The forensic evidence was accumulating quickly. Every piece of physical evidence seemed to point in the same direction. Every detail seemed to confirm what the detectives had already begun to suspect, that the boy had killed Robert Crawford. The boy's phone records were obtained through a warrant. His location data showed his phone at his house at the beginning of the evening, and then at Robert's house at the time of the crime. His phone had then returned to his house. The digital footprint was as clear as the physical footprint. The evidence was layering upon itself. With each new piece of data, the case became stronger. With each new investigation, the likelihood of the boy's guilt became more certain. Friends of the boy were interviewed. Some had noticed that he had been acting strangely in the days before the crime. Some had noticed that he had been asking questions about Robert Crawford. Some had mentioned that the boy had spoken about wanting to do something that would make him famous, that would make people remember him, that would make him stand out from all the other ordinary kids in the world. These statements were documented. These statements were added to the growing file of evidence. The boy's mother was interviewed. She said that her son had seemed troubled lately. She said that he had been struggling at school. She said that he had been having difficulty with his peer relationships. She said that he had expressed frustration with his life and his circumstances. She said that she had tried to help him, tried to talk to him, tried to understand what was bothering him. but she also said that she had never imagined he was capable of violence. She had never suspected that he was planning to harm anyone. She had been shocked by the accusations, shocked by the evidence, shocked by the realization that her son might be capable of what the police were suggesting. The investigation moved forward. The evidence accumulated. The case that had seemed so uncertain immediately after the crime began to crystallize into something clear and undeniable. The boy had killed Robert Crawford. The why was less clear than the what and the how, but the basic facts were solid. The boy had traveled to Robert's house. The boy had entered the house. The boy had committed an act of violence. The boy had left the house. The boy had returned home. Every step had been documented. Every movement had been captured. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The system that seemed so uncertain in the beginning had found its answer. A psychological evaluation of the boy was ordered by the court. A psychologist named Dr. Marcus Webb was assigned to interview the boy and assess his mental state, his capacity to understand the consequences of his actions, his understanding of right and wrong, his psychological profile, and risk factors. Dr. Webb was a forensic psychologist who had spent 20 years conducting evaluations of juveniles suspected of serious crimes. He had interviewed hundreds of young people. He had learned to recognize patterns in behavior, in speech, in demeanor that suggested various psychological conditions and personality traits. The boy sat across from Dr. Webb in an interview room. He maintained the same composure that he had displayed during the police interrogation. He answered questions directly and without apparent emotional response. When asked about his feelings regarding Robert Crawford's death, the boy said that he felt bad about it. But when asked to elaborate, when asked to explain what he felt bad about, the boy couldn't articulate a genuine emotional response. He said that he felt bad because people were upset. He said that he felt bad because the situation was difficult. But he did not express sadness about the loss of a human life. He did not express concern about Robert Crawford as a person. He did not display any of the normal emotional responses that would be expected from a 13-year-old who had killed someone. Dr. Webb asked about the boy's interest in the media coverage of the case. The boy acknowledged that he had been following the news. The boy acknowledged that he was aware that the case was getting attention. When asked how he felt about that attention, the boy's response was telling. He said that he found it interesting. He said that he was curious to see how the case developed. He said that he wanted to know what people were saying about him. His focus seemed to be entirely on himself, on his own situation, on how the crime and its aftermath affected him, rather than on the loss of life or the impact on Robert Crawford's family. Dr. Webb's assessment was completed and submitted to the court. He noted that the boy displayed characteristics consistent with what psychologists sometimes call a personality disturbance. He noted that the boy showed limited capacity for empathy. He noted that the boy seemed primarily focused on his own needs and interests. He noted that the boy's response to his own serious crime seemed more characterized by curiosity than by remorse. He noted that these characteristics suggested a level of psychological dysfunction that might affect how the justice system should approach his case, but he also noted that the boy clearly understood the difference between right and wrong, understood that killing was illegal, and appeared to have acted with conscious intent and deliberation. The psychologist's report became part of the case file. It became part of the documentation that would be presented to the jury. It became part of the accumulation of evidence that suggested that this was not a case of a confused child acting without understanding. This was a case of a young person who had planned to do something dramatic, something that would attract attention, something that would make him stand out. And he had done that. He had killed Robert Crawford. And he had stood in the police interrogation without apparent fear or remorse. He had looked at the security footage without acknowledging his own guilt. He had participated in a psychological evaluation without displaying any genuine emotional response. He was a boy who seemed to be more interested in the attention that his crime was generating than in the crime itself or its consequences. The first hearing in the case was scheduled for 2 weeks after Robert's body was discovered. The courtroom was crowded with media and community members who had read about the case and wanted to see the boy who was accused of killing their neighbor. Robert's family attended. His ex-wife came. His adult children came. His siblings came. They filled one section of the gallery, a physical manifestation of the loss they were experiencing, a statement about the connections that had been severed by the boy's actions. The boy entered the courtroom. He was small. He was 13. He wore appropriate clothing, not a detention jumpsuit, because the juvenile system tried to preserve some dignity for young defendants. But restraints connected his wrists to a chain around his waist. The visible restraints were necessary, required by security protocols. They were also symbolically significant. They announced to everyone in the courtroom that this boy was being held because he was suspected of a serious crime. He was not a free person. He was a person in custody. He was a person who the system had determined was dangerous enough to require physical restraint. As he walked toward the defense table, he made eye contact with the gallery. His eyes passed over the family of Robert Crawford. He did not show any sign of recognition, any sign of remorse, any sign that he understood the impact of what he had done on these people. His expression remained neutral. His demeanor remained calm. He sat down at the defense table next to his attorney. His mother, who was in the gallery behind him, put her face in her hands. She could not bear to look at her son. She could not bear to acknowledge what her son had become, what her son had done, how her son had transformed from a child into someone who could kill and then sit in a courtroom without apparent remorse. The judge entered. The courtroom rose. The judge, a man named Thomas Ashford, took his seat and opened the proceedings. He explained the charges. He explained the defendant's rights. He explained the process that was about to unfold. He asked how the defendant pleaded. The attorney said that the defendant would be pleading not guilty at this time. The judge set trial dates. The judge discussed bail. The hearing was relatively brief and procedural. But what struck everyone in the courtroom was not the legal proceedings. What struck everyone was the complete absence of emotional response from the boy. He did not cry. He did not appear frightened. He did not appear to be experiencing any of the emotions that would be typical for a 13-year-old who had been charged with murder. When the hearing was concluded, as the boy was being led away from the courtroom, he turned and looked back at the gallery one more time. His expression was difficult to read. It could have been curiosity. It could have been defiance. It could have been the kind of disconnected observation that someone might make if they were watching a scene in a movie rather than experiencing it in their own life. Robert's mother had to leave the courtroom. The accumulated weight of what she had just witnessed was too much for her. Her son was dead. Her son's killer was a child from the neighborhood. And that child had sat in a courtroom without any apparent sense of wrongdoing, without any apparent sense of loss, without any apparent understanding that what he had done was wrong. The trial began 3 months after the initial hearing. By that time, the evidence had been thoroughly documented. By that time, the forensic investigation had been completed. By that time, the case against the boy had become overwhelming in its clarity. The trial was not expected to last long. The evidence was too clear. The timeline was too precise. The physical evidence was too damning. But the legal system required that every case be presented to a jury, that every piece of evidence be challenged, that both sides be given the opportunity to present their version of events. The courtroom on the first day of trial was packed. The media had covered the case extensively. The public was interested in the story of the 13-year-old boy who had killed his neighbor. The gallery was filled with journalists and community members and people who simply wanted to witness the trial. The jury had been selected after a careful process of questioning designed to determine if potential jurors could be fair and impartial despite the media coverage and the public interest. The boy entered the courtroom. He was wearing appropriate clothing. He was in restraints. He was smaller than most of the attorneys in the courtroom. He was younger than any of the jurors. He was a child, and yet he was being tried for murder. He sat at the defense table and looked around the courtroom. He seemed almost fascinated by the proceedings, as though he was genuinely curious about what was about to happen, as though he was interested in seeing how the case would unfold. His mother was in the gallery. His stepfather was in the gallery. They looked exhausted. They looked like people who had been carrying a weight that was becoming unbearable. The judge, the same Judge Ashford who had presided over the initial hearing, entered the courtroom. He was a man in his 60s who had been a judge for over 20 years. He had seen hundreds of cases. He had developed a kind of institutional knowledge about how the justice system worked, about how people responded under stress, about how criminals behaved when they were confronted with the reality of their crimes. He looked at the boy and made a mental note of the boy's demeanor. He would remember it throughout the trial. He would think about it when the evidence was being presented. He would consider it when determining how to proceed with the case. The opening statements began. The prosecutor presented the case. She outlined the evidence. She explained the timeline. She promised the jury that the evidence would be clear and overwhelming. She promised that when the trial concluded, they would have no doubt about the boy's guilt. The defense attorney presented his opening statement. He acknowledged that something terrible had happened. He asked the jury to consider the boy's age, his youth, his lack of prior criminal history. He argued that while the boy might have been present at the crime scene, it was possible that he was not the one who had committed the violence. It was possible that someone else had been involved. It was possible that the evidence could be interpreted differently. It was a weak argument, but it was the best argument available to someone defending an indefensible case. The jury was sworn in. The trial began. The prosecution's first witness took the stand. The evidence began to accumulate. With each testimony, with each presentation of physical evidence, the case against the boy became clearer. The jury watched intently. The boy watched with apparent curiosity. Robert's family sat in the gallery and listened to the details of how their loved one had died. The trial that was expected to last a week began its slow progress toward a verdict that everyone in the courtroom already knew was coming. The surveillance footage was played for the jury. The video showed a boy in dark clothes walking down a suburban street. The quality was clear enough that facial features were visible. The quality was clear enough that the clothing could be identified. The quality was clear enough that there was no question about the identity of the person in the video. The camera had captured the boy walking toward Robert's house at 7:52 in the evening. The camera had captured him arriving at the front door. The camera had captured him departing at 8:23 in the evening. The timestamp was precise. The timeline was irrefutable. An expert witness testified about how the shoe prints found at the crime scene matched the shoes that the boy had been wearing. The expert explained the points of similarity. The expert explained how distinctive the wear pattern was on the sole of the shoe. The expert explained that the probability of the shoe prints matching by random chance was less than 1 in 10,000. The evidence was clear. The shoe prints belonged to the boy. The phone location data was presented. An expert from the cellular provider explained how the location services on the boy's phone had tracked his movements. The data showed his phone at his house in the morning and afternoon. The data showed his phone moving through the neighborhood in the evening, arriving at Robert's house, and then returning to his house. The data was consistent with the surveillance footage. The data corroborated every other piece of evidence. The timeline that had been established by the cameras was confirmed by the digital trail of the phone. Neighbors testified about what they had observed. A woman testified that she had seen the boy walking down the street toward Robert's house in the evening. A man testified that he had noticed lights on in Robert's house that seemed unusual, which had prompted him to check on Robert and discover the body. Another neighbor testified that the boy had seemed withdrawn and strange in the days before the crime, that he had mentioned wanting to do something that would make him famous, that he had spoken about feeling invisible and unimportant in the world. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death. The testimony was clinical and precise. It was not graphic, but it was clear. Robert Crawford had died from blunt force trauma. The injuries were consistent with a violent assault. The time of death, based on the body's condition, was approximately the time when the boy had been present at the house. The evidence was overwhelming. A forensic psychologist testified about the boy's psychological state. The psychologist explained the evaluation that had been conducted. The psychologist explained that the boy understood the difference between right and wrong. The psychologist explained that the boy had been aware that his actions were illegal. The psychologist explained that the boy's apparent lack of remorse suggested that he either did not fully understand the impact of his actions or did not care about the impact of his actions. Either way, the psychologist testified, the evidence suggested that the boy had acted with deliberation and intent. Day after day, witness after witness took the stand. Piece after piece of evidence was presented. The defense attorney had few weapons to use against the overwhelming evidence. He cross-examined witnesses, but the witnesses' testimony remained consistent. He challenged the forensic evidence, but the forensic evidence was sound. He argued that his client deserved consideration based on his age, but the evidence of premeditation and planning suggested that age alone could not excuse what had been done. The boy sat at the defense table and watched the evidence mount against him. Slowly, over the course of the trial, his demeanor changed. His confidence began to crack. His certainty about his ability to escape the consequences of his actions began to erode. By the end of the prosecution's case, he looked less like a boy who was fascinated by the proceedings and more like a boy who was beginning to understand that he was about to be convicted of murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, examining the forensic reports, analyzing the timeline. 3 days of wrestling with the question of guilt and innocence, though in this case there was little doubt about which side of that question the evidence pointed toward. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the jury sent a note to the judge indicating that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled. Everyone who had any connection to the case returned to their seats. The boy was brought from the holding area where he had been waiting. His mother was in the gallery. Robert's family was in the gallery. The media was in the gallery. The community members who had been following the case were in the gallery. The jury entered. Their expressions were difficult to read. Some seemed sad. Some seemed angry. Some seemed resigned to the fact that they had had to deliver a guilty verdict. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood and said that they had. The judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty? The word hung in the air. The jury had found the boy guilty of murder. The evidence had been sufficient. The testimony had been sufficient. The forensic evidence had been sufficient. The boy was guilty. For the first time in the entire trial, genuine emotion crossed the boy's face. His composure cracked. He looked at his mother. He looked at the judge. He looked at the jury. And then he looked at the cameras. The media cameras were positioned in the back of the courtroom. The cameras were recording everything. The cameras were documenting every moment. And the boy, in that moment of being found guilty of murder, did something that would become the defining image of the trial. He looked directly at the camera, and he waved. It was not a wave of surrender. It was not a wave of despair. It was not a wave that suggested he understood the gravity of his situation. It was a wave that suggested he still thought that somehow this moment, this conviction, this wave itself, was something that could be used to his advantage. It was a wave that suggested he still believed that the attention that was being paid to him, the cameras that were recording him, the media that was covering his case, were somehow proof of his importance. It was a wave that suggested a complete and utter disconnection from reality. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people stood up involuntarily. Some people shouted objections or protests. Robert's mother made a sound that was something between a cry and an exclamation of disbelief. The boy's mother put her face in her hands. The judge's expression shifted from controlled to something else entirely. Something that looked like anger or disappointment, or a recognition that the boy's wave had revealed something about his character that no amount of defense argument could mitigate. The judge stood. The judge called for order. The judge looked at the boy with an expression that suggested that he was seeing something in the boy that he hadn't fully recognized before. Judge Ashford waited for the commotion in the courtroom to die down. He waited for the shock to fade. He waited for the normal protocols of the courtroom to reassert themselves. And then he called the boy to approach the bench. The bailiff led the boy forward. The judge looked down at him. The judge's expression was carefully controlled, but there was something in his eyes that suggested genuine anger. Judge Ashford spoke quietly, but his words carried through the courtroom. He said that the wave that the boy had just made was a profound expression of disrespect. He said that it revealed an attitude that was inconsistent with remorse or understanding. He said that it demonstrated a lack of comprehension about the gravity of what had just been determined, that the boy had killed another human being. The judge explained that this courtroom was not a place for performance. This courtroom was not a place for games. This courtroom was not a place where someone could treat a murder conviction as though it were an opportunity for self-aggrandizement. The judge said that he had presided over hundreds of cases. He said that he had seen many defendants respond to convictions in many different ways, but he had rarely seen a response that was so fundamentally disconnected from reality as the wave that the boy had just made. The judge said that the wave would not be forgotten. The judge said that the wave would be taken into account when he was determining the appropriate sentence. The judge said that the wave revealed something about the boy's character, about his capacity for understanding and empathy, about his fundamental suitability for rehabilitation. The judge said that he was postponing the sentencing hearing. He said that he needed time to consider how to proceed with a case involving a defendant who seemed so completely unable to comprehend the impact of his actions. The judge ordered that the boy be remanded to custody. The judge ordered that the boy have no contact with the media. The judge ordered that the boy not be permitted to make any statements that might be recorded or publicized. The judge was putting limits on the boy's ability to further perform, to further seek attention, to further use the courtroom as a stage for whatever psychological needs were driving his behavior. The boy's expression changed. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he had made a mistake. For the first time, he seemed to grasp that the wave, which he had apparently intended to be clever or memorable or powerful, had actually revealed something about himself that was deeply damaging. The courtroom was adjourned. Robert's family was approached by supporters. The media rushed out to begin covering the story of the wave. The boy was led away from the courtroom. As he was being escorted out, he did not look back. He did not make eye contact with anyone. He did not smile or wave. He simply allowed himself to be led away. And in that moment, something shifted. The performance was ending. The reality of what he had done, the reality of his conviction, the reality of the sentence that was about to be imposed, was beginning to penetrate his consciousness. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the verdict. 2 weeks of the boy sitting in juvenile detention, contemplating what had happened, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of the consequences that he was about to face. 2 weeks of his mother struggling with the reality of what her son had done, what her son was, what her son would become as a result of his conviction. 2 weeks of the community processing the conviction, processing the wave, processing the realization that a child from the neighborhood had killed Robert Crawford and had shown no remorse, had shown no understanding, had shown nothing but a kind of detached fascination with the attention that the case was generating. On the day of the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was full again. The media was there. The community was there. Robert's family was there. The boy's family was there. The judge entered and took his seat. The judge looked at the boy. The judge's expression suggested that he had had time to think about the case, to process what had happened, to consider what was appropriate in terms of a sentence. The prosecutor presented arguments about the severity of the crime. The prosecutor talked about Robert Crawford's life, about the loss, about the impact on the community. The prosecutor talked about the evidence of planning and premeditation. The prosecutor talked about the boy's apparent lack of remorse. The prosecutor recommended a sentence of 30 years, which would mean that the boy would not be eligible for parole until he was in his 40s. The defense attorney presented arguments about the boy's age. He talked about adolescent development, about the neurological changes that were still occurring in the teenage brain, about the possibility of rehabilitation. He asked the judge to consider the boy's potential for change, his potential for growth, his potential for becoming a different person than the person who had committed the crime. He asked for leniency, for a sentence that would acknowledge the boy's youth, but would also hold him accountable for his actions. Robert's family presented victim impact statements. His ex-wife spoke about the loss, about the man he had been, about the future that had been taken from him. His adult children spoke about growing up without a father, about the pain of losing him in such a violent way, about the difficulty of processing the fact that he had been killed by a child from the neighborhood. Each statement was an expression of grief and loss and the fundamental unfairness of what had happened. Judge Ashford listened to all of it, and then he spoke. He addressed the boy directly. He said that the boy had committed a terrible crime. He said that the evidence was overwhelming. He said that the boy's apparent lack of remorse was concerning. He said that the wave that the boy had made after the verdict had revealed something about his character that could not be ignored. He said that he had considered the boy's age carefully. He said that he understood that the boy was young, that the boy's brain was still developing, that there was theoretically a possibility of rehabilitation. But, the judge continued, there was a line that separated childhood mistakes from criminal acts. There was a line between youthful indiscretion and calculated violence. The judge said that the boy had crossed that line. The judge said that the boy had killed a man who had done nothing to him, who had posed no threat to him, who had simply existed as a quiet neighbor in the same community. The judge said that this act could not be excused by age alone. The judge said that accountability was necessary. The judge said that the community needed to know that there would be consequences for taking another person's life. The judge sentenced the boy to 25 years in prison. The judge said that the boy would be eligible for parole after serving 20 years. The judge said that during those 20 years, the boy would have the opportunity to develop remorse, to understand what he had done, to become a different person. But the judge made clear that this was not a guarantee. The judge said that if, at the time of the parole hearing, the boy still showed no remorse, still showed no understanding of what he had done, the parole could be denied. The judge said that the boy's future, his possibility of ever being released from prison, depended entirely on his capacity to change, to grow, and to develop a genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. The gavel fell. The sentence was final. The boy had been found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would spend his youth in prison. He would spend his young adulthood in prison. He would not be free until he was in his late 30s at the earliest. The wave that he had thought would be powerful, that he had thought would be remembered as a moment of significance, had instead become the moment that had sealed his fate. The boy's transfer to the prison system was handled with the care that was typically used with juvenile offenders. He was not transferred to an adult prison immediately. Instead, he was transferred to a juvenile detention facility where he would remain until he turned 18. After that, depending on his behavior and his status, he might be transferred to an adult facility, or he might remain in the juvenile system for longer. The judge had been clear that the boy's future would depend on his ability to demonstrate change, to show remorse, to prove that he understood what he had done and why it was wrong. In the weeks and months following the sentencing, the media coverage began to fade. The story that had dominated the local news cycle began to be replaced by other stories, other crimes, other dramas that captured the public's attention. The boy's name was no longer in the headlines. The wave that he had made was no longer being discussed by every news outlet. Life in the community began to return to a kind of normalcy, though it was a different kind of normalcy than the community had known before. Robert's house remained on the market for several months before finally being sold to new owners from another state who knew nothing about what had happened there. The other neighbors tried to move forward, tried to forget, tried to process the trauma of living in a place where someone they knew had been killed by a child from the neighborhood. The boy sat in his cell and had time to think about what he had done. He had time to contemplate the reality of his situation. He had time to understand, or perhaps to begin to understand, that his actions had had consequences that were real and permanent and that would follow him for the rest of his life. Whether he ever truly developed remorse, whether he ever came to genuinely understand the impact of his actions on Robert's family, on the community, on himself, was a question that only he could answer. Judge Ashford reflected on the case sometimes. He thought about the wave. He thought about how that single gesture had revealed something about the boy's character that no amount of testimony or evidence could have revealed. He thought about how people sometimes revealed their true selves in the most unexpected moments. He thought about how the justice system had to balance accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation, punishment with the hope for change, the protection of society with the understanding that young people's brains were still developing, still capable of growth. The case became a reference point for discussions about juvenile justice. It was cited in legal arguments. It was discussed in criminology classes. It was analyzed in psychology courses. The wave became a symbol of arrogance, a symbol of the disconnection that sometimes existed between young offenders and the gravity of their crimes, a symbol of the moment when performance became reality, and reality became something that could not be performed away. The courtroom was empty now except for the cleaning staff who were collecting papers and straightening furniture. The judge's bench sat without the judge. The jury box sat without the jury. The gallery sat without the spectators. The space where so much drama had unfolded was now quiet, ready for the next case, ready for the next tragedy, ready for the next story of crime and justice. The courthouse staff had already begun the process of moving on to the next trial, the next case, the next prosecution. Outside the courthouse, the media trucks began to pack up. The reporters who had spent weeks covering the trial began to transition to other stories. The news cycle was moving on. The public's attention was being drawn to other events, other crimes, other narratives that were more current, more interesting, more novel. The boy's case was already becoming history, already being filed away in the archives of true crime, already being transformed from a living, breathing reality into a story that people would read about online or listen to in a podcast. Robert's family was left with the permanent reality of his absence. His ex-wife had to process the loss and the strange trauma of knowing that her former husband had been killed by a child, by a neighbor, by someone who was not a stranger, but who was not a close associate either. His children had to process the loss of their father and the complicated feelings that came from watching the person who had killed him receive a sentence that allowed for the possibility of parole, that allowed for the possibility that he might someday be free while their father was dead, while the void that he had left would never be filled. The community gradually moved past the case. New families moved into houses on that street. The neighborhood recovered. But there was something different now. There was an awareness that bad things could happen, that children could commit terrible acts, that suburban safety was not guaranteed. There was a recognition that you couldn't always know what was happening inside the homes around you. that you couldn't always predict who was dangerous and who wasn't, that the normal-looking neighbor could harbor darkness that you never fully understood until it was too late. The boy sat in his cell and grew older. His 18th birthday came and went. He was transferred to an adult facility. He continued to serve his sentence. He had years ahead of him, decades perhaps, depending on whether he was ever granted parole, depending on whether he ever demonstrated the kind of change that would convince a parole board that he was safe to release. The wave that he had made in the courtroom was long ago, a moment from a different life, a moment from a time when he had thought that the attention was good, that the fame was worth the price, that being remembered was what mattered. He had been wrong about all of it. He had learned perhaps, or perhaps he had not. Only he could know the truth of what went on inside his own mind. The courthouse steps where the boy had been photographed being led in restraints were now just steps. The courtroom where the trial had taken place was now just a room. The gallery where Robert's family had sat was now just seating. The spaces where the drama had unfolded had been absorbed back into the ordinary machinery of justice, had become the setting for other cases, other dramas, other stories of crime and consequence. Judge Ashford was asked about the case in an interview some years later. He was asked about the wave. He said that he had thought about that gesture many times over the years. He said that it was the most revealing moment in the entire trial, that it had shown him something about the boy that no amount of expert testimony could have revealed. He said that the wave had demonstrated an absence of understanding, an absence of empathy, an absence of any recognition of what he had done. He said that it was the kind of moment that reminded him why the justice system existed, why accountability was necessary, why consequences had to be real and permanent. The case was cited in legal discussions about how juveniles should be treated in the criminal justice system. Some people argued that the boy's sentence was too harsh, that youth should be weighed more heavily in sentencing decisions. Some people argued that the boy's sentence was too light, that the severity of the crime and the apparent lack of remorse should have resulted in a harsher sentence. The case became evidence for different positions in an ongoing debate about how to balance accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation, punishment with the hope for change, the protection of society with the understanding that people could grow and change. The wave itself had become famous in a way that the boy had never intended. It had become a symbol. It had become a teaching moment. It had become the most famous moment from the trial, more famous than the evidence, more famous than the testimony, more famous than the verdict. The image of the 13-year-old boy waving after being found guilty of murder was an image that stuck with people, that haunted them, that made them think about the nature of youth and responsibility, and the ways that sometimes a single gesture could reveal everything about a person. Robert Crawford's memory was preserved in the stories that his family told about him. He was remembered as a quiet man who had lived a good life, who had been a good neighbor, who had deserved better than what had happened to him. He was not remembered primarily as the man who was killed by the 13-year-old boy. He was remembered as a person, as a man with qualities and characteristics, and a presence that had meant something to the people who had known him. His life had been cut short, but the impact of his life, the memory of who he had been, remained in the consciousness of the people he had touched. The boy, now a man serving his sentence, existed in a different kind of memory. He was remembered as the teenager who had killed his neighbor. He was remembered as the boy who had waved after the guilty verdict. He was remembered as the person who had revealed, through his own actions and gestures, an absence of the basic human capacity for empathy and understanding. Whether that was who he truly was, whether he would ever change, whether he would ever develop a genuine understanding of what he had done, these questions remained unanswered, perhaps permanently unanswered, perhaps not to be answered until or unless he was released from prison and given the opportunity to demonstrate that he had become someone different than the person he had been. The courthouse where the trial had taken place continued to operate. The judge who had presided over the case continued to hear cases. The prosecutors continued their work. The community continued forward. And somewhere in a prison cell, a young man sat with the consequences of choices he had made when he was 13 years old. He had wanted to be remembered. He had achieved that goal. He was remembered. But the memory was not the one he had imagined. The wave was not remembered as a gesture of power or significance. It was remembered as a revelation of his own emptiness, a moment when he had revealed, to everyone watching, the absence of anything resembling a conscience, a moment when a single gesture had said everything that needed to be said about who he was and what he was capable of. The gavel had fallen, the trial was over, the sentence was served, and the wave, once made, could never be unmade. It existed now in the permanent record of the case, in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it, in the digital archives of news coverage, in the consciousness of a community that had been touched by the terrible reality that violence could come from anywhere, that evil was sometimes smaller and younger than people expected, that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who understood so little about the harm they caused that they seemed genuinely confused when they were held accountable for it.